This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a resolution which had been unanimously passed in Congress to restore the citizenship of Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. We've talked a lot on this show about the years after the Civil War, the process by which there was reconciliation and reconstruction of the southern states, and we've touched on how about 100 or so years later, the lost cause myth was still persistent, and there were fading memories of the war, a reimagining of what the Civil War really was and what it was all about. And here was this moment where the President of the United States was retroactively restoring citizenship to the man who led the southern states in secession. A super interesting moment, not least because it feels like Jefferson Davis probably would not have even wanted this act from everything that he told us when he was alive. But let's talk about it. As always, here are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Yeah, I'm curious about this question of whether Davis would have wanted this. Do you want to start there before we get to the pardon? Yeah. Because if you were to simply say, which seems like a logical question, would Jefferson Davis have wanted to be pardoned? What do we know?
Okay, hold up. First, can I just say, like I've said over and over on this podcast before, I love Jimmy Carter. I love Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter can do no wrong. And I look at this moment and I'm like, damn it, Jim. Yeah. Why? Why? This was so unnecessary, particularly for a person that was unrepentant when it came to, fighting in the Civil War and his stance. He essentially says, Jefferson Davis essentially says, like, yeah, I would do it again. And I don't want to pardon. Yeah. Meaning all of the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, he would do it again. In this sort of, he's essentially saying a pardon is for someone who is repentant and I'm not sorry. Yeah. So what are you supposed to do with that? It'd be one thing if Jefferson Davis was saying, like, I really regret actions that happened, things like that. There's none of that.
Yeah, I think we've actually talked about this in a much different case, in the case of Rosa Parks. And there was all of this talk about her getting a retroactive pardon or having her record expunged. And of course, like, she didn't want her record expunged. Like, that was an act of civil disobedience she was engaged in. Here, he was engaged in a literal act of rebellion that came at the cost of 600,000 lives at least.
Yeah, more than that.
Yeah, and he wasn't sorry about it. And he didn't want a pardon. It's something he talked about at the time. Like, right. Don't give it to me. I don't want it.
And we could go do, we probably will do specific episodes about the pardons in the wake of the war. But, in 1868, Andrew Johnson issues a kind of general pardon. It's on Christmas Day. And Davis is like on trial for treason, is kind of like carved out from that. People had like very explicitly looked at this particular question. I guess this is citizenship, not pardon. I wonder if there's a distinction there for you. But, had looked at this very specific question of kind of what do we do with Jefferson Davis's status. People had looked at that very explicitly and kind of said, we're not going to go there. He doesn't want it, better not. And so I don't know if we want to cut to a decade or so later, but it's important to realize that it was controversial in the 1870s in a way that it is not controversial, seemingly, in the 1970s.
Yeah, to me, I go back to this quote that he gives in 1884 where he says, and I'm using part of the quote, but yet I deliberately say if I were to do it all over again, I would do just as I did in 1861. And so fast forward 25 years, And his sentiment really remains. He was steadfast in his commitment to the Confederacy. And I think that says a lot about, how he wanted to be remembered. He did not want to be seen as someone who was apologetic about his stance. He wanted to be seen as someone who, till his dying day, he held on to his beliefs and his commitments.
And if we leapfrog forward a century from that point to the 1970s, there's a couple of different tracks, I think, that are playing into this. One, the 1970s are the decade of the pardon. Gerald Ford pardons Richard Nixon. There's general amnesty given to Vietnam, people who were drafted for the Vietnam War but then fled the country. And this comes in that same moment. And in both the case of Nixon and the draft dodgers, neither one of them was repentant. Right? They all thought that they did the right thing. So it is a particular moment of pardon in order to keep the nation from fracturing even more. But I think in the case of Jefferson Davis, which parts of the nation are you trying to make sure don't fracture? Here you have this newly elected Southern Democrat president who is signing this bill into law. But again, like you said, non-controversial in 1977, at least among the people in Congress.
I would say one of the closest analogies in this sort of wave of pardons and moves towards reconciliation that you point out is Robert E. Lee. His citizenship is restored in 1976, but Lee had kind of actively worked towards reconciliation later in his life. So, when you look into the specifics of it all, I mean, the rationales are different.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter's from Georgia. He's, a self-proclaimed son of the South. And I think for him, issuing this proclamation was a way of sort of also signaling to the South or his, fellow constituents, I am one of you. I share this idea that, that certain people have been maligned or that reputations have been stained. And I think it was a way of him trying to recover some of the reputation of people who were very sympathetic toward the Confederate cause. But for him to say, the war between the states, right there, that I know.
Little tell, I think they call it in poker.
Tell. You might as well say the war of northern aggression. That's essentially, how we shape that narrative of not using specific language like the Civil War or war fought over slavery or things of that nature that really go back to the core issues of what the Civil War is about, I think is a real tell.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Can I ask you something to just sort of parse for us a little bit, the different levels of reimagining of the war that are going on here? Because it's one to say, and Carter does employ this language, he says something like, we need to clear away the guilt and enmities and recriminations of the past to finally set to rest the divisions that threaten to destroy our nation. So that's something that's about kind of where we are in this moment and reconciling with this tragedy in our past. But you are also getting at, and I think we've talked about on the show, that there's not just a kind of let's put that in the past, but a reimagining. What we thought that was is not actually what it was, which, I just want to separate those two. Those are two different projects, right?
Yes. The lost cause, which I know we've talked about before, this lost cause ideology, this belief the South is really reshaping the narrative of how we understand the Civil War as slavery is a necessary evil. It's also interesting that it's 78 in this year, but in 77, Roots comes out. Roots has one of the highest ratings of all time. But right on the heels of that is the re-airing of Gone with the Wind on national television. Mm-hmm. And people have a like a deep, long-standing relationship with Gone with the Wind and all of the romance and nostalgia that goes in as the South is like a pleasant past. And so all of these things I think are working sort of in conversation together when we think about the country, its identity, the South, where it stands, where people are in terms of their popular sentiments about the South. I think all that comes into play.
And I agree with you, Jody, that they're two different things, sort of reimagining the past and then trying to move forward and reconcile from the past. But I think in the case of the Civil War in the 1970s, as Kellie was talking about in particular with Gone with the Wind, one allows the other. So having that ability to say, well, I mean, even in the bill, it says that Davis had served the United States long and honorably as a soldier before joining the Confederacy. This idea that these were honorable men, and some of them may have been led astray, and there had been this rebellion, and there does need to be reconciliation. But again, really, they're not talking about slavery in this bill. And I think that matters. I also think that it matters that this is happening in the 1970s after the Civil Rights Act, after the Voting Rights Act, when I think a lot of white politicians were like, well, we took care of that. So now we don't need to keep revisiting the sins of the past because we have sort of washed our souls clean by offering full and equal citizenship, whether or not that actually happened, but through this legislation. So now this is now a past problem and not a present problem.
There's some analysis from the time. There's a 1994 paper by a professor at Southern Virginia University who kind of puts this in interesting context as well. I'm not sure if I fully buy it, but the nation is coming off of Vietnam, as you mentioned, Vietnam, Watergate. There's the Church Committee hearings, which we've done a big series on this show. There's a sort of general disillusionment with government, and so that maybe there was an appetite here or sympathy towards a figure like Jefferson Davis, who was, to put it mildly, disillusioned with the United States, but like just kind of like the idea that like, oh, he was a rabble rouser and he was like fighting against the government that he felt was unjust. So let's forget the details of why and how, but like there's a general, I don't necessarily buy that logic, but it's an interesting provocation, and I think gets at like a real sort of reimagining of him as, you know, he was a freedom fighter for a cause that maybe I don't believe in, but you got to respect the hustle or whatever.
But you could say the same thing about Timothy McVeigh.
Right.
You know, you could say like he was a veteran, he fought for this country before he blew up people in Oklahoma City. Like that, separating out those two narratives.
That's the whole point.
No one would ever do that. You know, no one would ever go back.
Maybe
and be
in 100 years.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Well, I mean, we see it happening.
Going down.
I mean, we see it happening in real time for a lot of the stuff that's happened over the last, few years, for sure. I mean, the other interesting thing here is Carter does, as we said, pardon people who dodged the Vietnam draft, and in some way uses a similar logic here of just kind of saying, like, I know how divisive wars can be, and it's time to move past that. I do get that instinct, right? But I also think, like, you have to just look at cases for what they are and sort of not be afraid of assigning moral judgment to whether one move was laudable and one move was reprehensible.
It's the difference between reconciliation and truth and reconciliation.
Right.
They're different projects, and this is very much focused on reconciling, again, part of the country.
I was going to say,
100 years
who
later.
are we reconciling?
Yeah.
Not the descendants of slaves. You know, like it, to me, that all of this feels unnecessary. This is not needed. This is not wanted. It's what allows it to pass sort of unanimously. Like there's no real dog in the fight because this is not a conversation that has to be litigated again. And so people are like, yeah, sure, fine. You know, it seems like the buy-in of passing this should have been more contested. But the fact that it was not tells me that this was not something where the stakes were high.
Right. And I wonder what you think about that, Kellie, in terms of, where we are in the broad Black civil rights movement or freedom struggle of the 20th century, right? There's this time in the 60s where there is a very visible national leadership that is active in a bunch of different ways. And in the 70s and 80s, it's not to say that there's not a lot of Black activism and Black leadership, but it's diffused in some ways, and it's kind of less present in this kind of conversation, or it seems to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that's because, I mean, they're still reeling from like the backlash of the 60s and the 70s. You know, there's not as much space for people to have those same kind of platforms. MLK doesn't have a national birthday at this time. You know, it still takes time for King to get his birthday acknowledged. And I think that's something worth sitting with, the fact that we were quicker to pardon, you know, this war criminal than we were someone who had actually fought to improve the nation.
Yeah. There are parts of Carter's statement here that, at the very least, I see the logic of like, this actually isn't about Jefferson Davis. This is about us, right? This isn't about him. This is about us, and then what we need in this country. But then there are these moments where they go out of their way to also cast this judgment on Davis, and it ties into so many of the conversations we have about memorializing the Civil War, including memorials themselves. And I just want to flag that there's this, I spent a while in the New Yorker archives. There's this 1980 article by Robert Penn Warren, you know, legendary writer and poet. And he wrote this massive article sort of hooked to, and, you know, Southerner, and sort of hooked to this moment. But it's all about his family and his family history and his grandfather who had memories of the war and all these things. But then a Jefferson Davis statue going up in his town, and how like the statue goes up, but it's not just the statue goes up. Then like the Ku Klux Klan is invited to do a cross burning there, and everyone's like, wait a minute, what's going on? You know, and I wouldn't say Warren comes down on necessarily one side or the other, but it was a reminder of how fraught these conversations are, and that you don't get to just have a very narrow, uncontextualized conversation about a pardon or a memorial or whatever. It is all tied together. So that's a really great article. And by the way, I also noticed it's like, it extends literally over 50 pages in the new. I mean, it's a really, really long article, but also the thing I noticed was, gosh, there's a lot of ads in print magazines in 1980 compared to now. I mean, that was like the heyday. I was like, oh, right. I remember magazine writing. It used to be this very lucrative thing.
It used to be lucrative.
Yeah, I know.
All right. Well, is there anything else we want to touch on there? Or should we leave it there?
I think one other thing to say about this, I know that Jimmy Carter has gotten the brunt of the analysis here, but this is a bill that passed through the Senate and the House. And the Senate co-sponsors were 3 Republicans, Mark Hatfield of Oregon, Orrin Hatch of Utah, and, of course, Strom Thurmond. And I think that I know it wasn't a divisive bill, but as we're looking back at the way that this bill came into being, I think that the name Strom Thurmond matters. Joe Biden was on the Judiciary Committee that passed it through, which also speaks to how very long Joe Biden was in the Senate. Yeah. But I guess Strom Thurmond was probably there longer.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Like we said, I think we've name-checked them. We've done a lot of episodes around this moment and in the wake of the war, but really fascinating stuff. And thanks, as always, to Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson. Thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.